Ooh.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, there we go. Bienvenue tout le monde to PAFSO's Tradecraft Week. Today's session is going to be with Ryan Trudeau and his present in his session. As PAFSO, we like to acknowledge that we are hosting the Tradecraft Week on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. PAFSO acknowledges them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. If anyone has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A, raise your hand, and our moderator for today, Iris Louie, will take it away.
Thanks, Marty. Yes, as Marty mentioned, my name is Iris, and I'm one of the IRCC reps from the Executive Committee, and I'm currently joining you from Denmark. As a professional association, one of PAFSO's priorities is to provide professional development opportunities such as this conference, but also to promote the effective functioning of the Foreign Service of Canada. And with a view to this objective, PAFSO has an anti-racism committee headed up by the brilliant CJ Scott, where we seek to identify and address issues of racism that are specific to FS officers in GAC and IRCC. I'm not going to go into the data, but it's well documented that a diverse workforce results in better outcomes in terms of innovation, productivity, and employee engagement, which we all know is really important battling this phenomenon of quiet quitting. And as our department slowly awaken to this notion, I think there's a lot of work left to us as individuals to understand the issues beyond simply completing another mandatory unconscious bias course. And that's why we are excited to bring you today's speaker for the Tradecraft Conference. So Ryan Trudeau is a certified trainer, change practitioner, and expert facilitator. He is a featured diversity, equity, and inclusion speaker on the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat's Federal Speakers Forum, where his talks focus on anti-racism, allyship, and change management. For most of 2022, he worked with GAC's Anti-Racism Secretariat, and prior to that, he was with ESDC, where he served as the departmental DEI co-champion. And most recently, Ryan has joined our ranks as a brand new FS in the MCO stream. So I'm especially excited to welcome him here, not only as a speaker, but also as a new Foreign Service officer. So you may take one look at Ryan and wonder what he might have to say about diversity, racism, and equality. However, he brings the perspective of many FS who may wonder what their role can and should be around these difficult topics. I think that Ryan would agree with me that the most effective learning occurs when one is actively engaged, and he's assured me that he doesn't shy away from uncomfortable questions that challenge. So I strongly encourage you to place any questions you might have throughout the presentation into the chat or the Q&A, and I look forward to a lively discussion as much as we can after the presentation. And even afterwards, if you're joining us, watching this as a recording, we do encourage you to continue the dialogue and contact us if you have other questions. So without further ado, I'll stop gabbing now and we'll welcome Ryan to the mic.
All right, unmuting is always very necessary when you do these things, right? So first thing, super important, I need to make sure that is working correctly. First of all, is the screen share working? If I can just get maybe a yes or a thumbs up or something, that'd be great.
Crystal clear.
Crystal clear, perfect.
Yes,
and obviously the microphone is working because you answered my question. So without further ado, and you know what, I just want to say a special thank you to PAFSO for inviting me. And, you know, I'm thrilled to be part of this community. You know, I've only joined the FS community just a couple of months ago. So this is a great kind of segue from one level of my career into another. And I couldn't be happier to have this discussion with you today. And I'm just thrilled to be here. Alors, premièrement, avant de commencer, c'est super important aussi que je précise que la terre dont que je bénéficie actuellement et où j'ai choisi de vivre est un territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Kanien'kehá:ka, autrement dit aussi les peuples Mohawks. Il héberge à présent de nombreuses Premières Nations différentes sur cette terre, étant dit aussi des Inuits et des Métis. La présence autochtone dans la grande région de Montréal, où ce que je reste actuellement, reste très fort et engagé. Et je suis reconnaissant d'avoir la possibilité de vivre et de travailler sur ce territoire. Je reconnais aussi mon privilège et ma position ici en tant que colon blanc et je m'engage à écouter et à apprendre continuellement des communautés autochtones de l'île de la Tortue. Je promets qu'à travers des présentations comme celle-ci, que je vais utiliser continuellement ma plateforme comme une voix active pour encourager d'autres colons comme moi à s'engager dans un parcours significatif et permanent qui vise à défaire activement les systèmes discriminatoires à l'égard des peuples autochtones au Canada et dans le monde entier. Alors, beaucoup d'entre vous se joindre à nous aujourd'hui de peut-être du Canada ou certaines d'ailleurs dans le monde, comme Iris à Danemark. Alors, je vous invite donc, si c'est possible, de profiter de cette occasion pour faire des recherches et réfléchir à la terre sur laquelle vous vous trouvez actuellement. Alors, quelques précisions avant de commencer. Je ne suis en aucun cas un genre d'expert en relations raciales ou un genre de chercheur ou un professionnel dans ce domaine. Okay? Il s'agit plutôt que c'est une présentation sur mon parcours personnel avec l'intention d'inspirer les autres personnes à agir et être le changement qu'ils souhaitent de voir. Toutes les informations, les outils et les ressources qui sont partagées dans cette présentation ont été accumulés tout au long de mon parcours et ils sont cités en conséquence. Je ne suis pas ici pour dire qui a raison ou non. Je suis simplement ici pour partager mon histoire avec vous. Alors enfin, veuillez noter aussi que les informations partagées dans cette présentation font référence à des matériaux, des informations et des anecdotes personnelles qui peuvent être un déclencheur pour certaines d'entre vous. Notez que je suis conscient et que si nécessaire, je peux aussi partager une liste de ressources qui sont disponibles pour tous les fonctionnaires fédéraux si vous souhaitez bien sûr ou vous avez besoin de les utiliser. So, first of all, right, the title of this talk, it has the term white fragility in it, right, which can be a little bit of an eyebrow raiser. And this is meant to be provocative. I did that on purpose, right? And it serves purely to demand your attention and even perhaps spur a certain notion of defensiveness. And when I'm saying this, right, I ask you to just please pay special attention to that feeling that you may have felt of defensiveness, perhaps, and do your best to just listen to the rest of this presentation with an open mind and an open heart, because I promise you it will make a difference. So what is white fragility anyways, right? Like, I know that when I first heard the term myself, I immediately got defensive. And I asked myself questions like, white fragility, what does this mean? Does this mean that, that I'm weak or something because I'm white? Now, obviously, I dug a little bit deeper after that, and I found out that it means a whole lot more. Now, there's a whole book by Dr. Robin DiAngelo that's written on this, so I can't do it justice right now just like this, but I will try to summarize it basically in one paragraph. So Dr. Robin DiAngelo explains that white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress can become intolerable for white people, and it triggers a range of defensive moves, right? And these moves can include the outward display of emotions like anger, fear, guilt, or behaviors like argumentation, silence, or even just leaving, right, the stress-inducing situation altogether. And I want you to keep these last two in mind specifically because I'm going to refer to them multiple times during my presentation this morning with you. Mais avant de vous présenter mon parcours perso, j'aimerais aussi vous partager quelques informations qui sont sur moi, en fait. Et j'aimerais aussi également partager ça parce que ça va être important pour que ça connecte vraiment toutes les informations par la suite qu'on avance ensemble. Alors, premièrement, très évident, je suis un homme blanc, je suis hétérosexuel, par contre, je suis bien portant, je suis né au Canada. Alors, je fais donc membre de la groupe au Canada la plus privilégiée. Je viens d'une famille classe moyenne du Canada et j'ai connu d'autres cultures très tôt dans ma vie grâce au sport, où donc je reconnais ça comme un grand privilège dans ma vie. J'ai épousé une femme noire qui est née en fait à l'extérieur du Canada et j'ai 2 enfants métisés. Mais j'aimerais aussi également réitérer que ce n'est pas parce que je suis marié à une femme noire et que j'ai des enfants métisés que je suis une sorte d'expert en matière de race et que je sais tout ce qui devrait être savoir sur c'est quoi être ou c'est quoi la réalité d'être noir. J'ai effectivement beaucoup appris en raison de la nature de ma famille, oui, absolument, mais je continue quand même jusqu'à aujourd'hui et chaque jour d'apprendre pourquoi et d'apprendre beaucoup et que je reconnais aussi, j'ai beaucoup à apprendre sur ce concept de race. Enfin aussi, je tiens aussi à me dissocier explicitement de tout concept ou lien avec le terme sauveur blanc. Je ne suis pas ici pour sauver qui quoi que ce soit. Nous sommes tous, en tant qu'individus, capables de nous sauver nous-mêmes. Je suis plutôt un individu qui s'est impliqué dans un engagement à vie pour être le changement que je veux voir, surtout pour mes enfants. So based off my background, right, it's also important that I acknowledge my privilege. And when talking about privilege, it's important here that I just really want to zoom in or focus in here on basically two main types of privilege that are stipulated here as earned and unearned privilege that was really put forward by a professor at the University of Carleton, Dr. Helena Fosu, who's absolutely brilliant. So Dr. Fosu explained that privilege in this context, when we talk about earned privilege, is things that basically you have to work for, right? Like gaining knowledge, earning your education, right? Earning a title like doctor, CEO, reverend, etc. And to earn and acquire earned privileges or advantages, people need to go through quite a bit of effort, right? And then that would be the opposite on this side, then that unearned privilege, what would it be? Well, you could take me, for example, right? I was lucky enough to have two parents who were smart and hardworking people growing up, who had enough money to provide me with a very good lifestyle. I'm able-bodied and I live in a country which has provided me with, access to healthcare and education. And all of these things would be examples of unearned privileges that I just have automatically that have set me right on a very good path. However, still need to be very straightforward here in saying that despite these advantages, right, I still had to put forward a solid amount of effort to overcome challenges in things like earning my education, developing my skills, building my career as a public servant. But to be fair, right, having life with these advantages was and continues to be very helpful. But yet the concept of privilege is often misunderstood. When people hear the word privilege, they can feel that it's used as a way of shaming them or denying the hard work that they had to do to accomplish their goals. Look, privilege means that you have had some advantages that other people didn't have, or that others had to deal with obstacles that you didn't have to deal with. So the concept of privilege based on skin color, especially, is often confused with other types of privilege, right? Mainly economic or educational. So for example, it could be very hard for a white person who's struggling financially, right? In an economic system that they feel is just as rigged against them as any other marginalized group, to see how they have privileges over any other marginalized group. But, they might not have had, they have had actually basically the privileges that these marginalized groups have not had. And they haven't had to live with the obstacles that a marginalized person has had to live through in countries just like Canada. So privilege isn't about shaming certain groups or comparing different types of challenges. It's about recognizing the privileges or advantages you feel you have and just reflecting to seek and learn about how to use that privilege as a tool to make a better world for those who you feel don't have the advantages that you have. So I invite you all just very briefly to reflect on the privileges you feel you have and just to be mindful of that as you're moving forward. Alors maintenant que nous avons une compréhension commune de c'est quoi la fragilité blanche et comment nous pouvons tous reconnaître nos propres privilèges, je vais maintenant partager avec vous mon parcours à travers le changement. Et je vous amènerai vraiment à travers ce parcours en utilisant un outil de gestion de changement qui s'appelle ADKAR pour décrire comment mon parcours a progressé et comment il continue à évoluer à chaque jour. Et j'aimerais commencer avec une citation de Léon Tolstoï qui me semble extrêmement pertinente dans ce contexte où ça lit « Chacun pense, excuse-moi, chacun pense à changer le monde, mais personne pense à changer soi-même. » Super pertinent. Alors, pour que tout le monde puisse suivre de près, right, mon parcours et toutes les étapes qui ont pris lieu, je voudrais résumer brièvement le concept de c'est quoi ADKAR, car cela vraiment va nous aider à faire le lien entre tous les éléments, fur et à mesure qu'on va avancer ensemble aujourd'hui. Alors, le A dans ADKAR, ADKAR c'est un acronyme en anglais. Le A dans ADKAR, c'est for awareness, ou en français, c'est la sensibilisation. Le changement, dans n'importe quoi tu fais dans votre vie, Le changement commence quand on comprend pourquoi. Change happens when you understand why a certain change needs to happen. And that's called the awareness. And this can really apply to pretty much anything in your life individually. Le D dans ADKAR, c'est pour désir. En English, for D, for desire. Le changement implique des décisions personnelles. You can be aware all you want about anything that you want to change in your life, right? But until you make a personal decision, that desire to change, then change will not happen. So le changement implique une décision personnelle. It takes desire to change, right? So you can just go on through life being aware about pretty much anything. But if you don't make that actual decision that you're going to do something about it, guess what? Nothing is going to happen, right? Le K dans ADKAR, c'est en anglais knowledge, connaissance en français. Le changement exige des connaissances. Tu peux être sensibilisé autant que vous voulez. Tu peux désirer vraiment de changer, ça se peut très bien. Mais si tu ne sais pas comment changer, si vous n'avez aucune connaissance de comment changer, de faire le comment, le quoi que ce soit, bien sûr, le changement, ça ne prendra jamais lieu. So you need to know what you need to do in order to make that change. And this can apply to anything, right? It can be a goal that you have about possibly getting in shape. It could be about anything, but if you don't know how to get in shape, right, then that change is never going to happen. So you need knowledge, right, in order for that change to happen. The fourth step est la quatrième étape ou le deuxième A. En anglais, c'est pour ability. En français, c'est la capacité. Le changement exige des gestes dans la bonne direction. On peut être sensibilisé, right, sur un sujet, n'importe quoi. On peut désirer le changement, absolument. On peut même nous éduquer nous-mêmes sur le sujet en question pour faire les changements. Mais aucun secret ici, si tu ne prends jamais des actions dans la bonne direction, mais bien sûr, les changements, ça ne prendra jamais lieu. If you don't take action in any type of direction about the change that you want to do, then of course, change will never happen. So A, that fourth step is crucial. You need to take action, even if it's a small one, in the right direction for change to start. And then finally, dernièrement, la dernière étape dans ADKAR, c'est le R pour le renforcement, R for reinforcement. Le changement doit être renforcé pour être soutenu, right? So you need to reinforce these actions over and over and over again in different ways in order for that desired change that you have in your life, for it to take place, okay? ADKAR, bien sûr, c'est un acronyme qui représente les 5 résultats qu'une personne doit atteindre de manière séquentielle, en ordre, pour qu'un changement soit réussi, right? Alors, Jeff Hyatt, qui est le fondateur de la compagnie Procy Inc., explique que ce modèle puissant est basé sur la compréhension que le changement se produit sur une base individuelle, OK? C'est pas comme des changements, ça s'applique pas à une compagnie, à un département entier, ça s'applique vraiment à la personne, à l'individu. Alors, maintenant que nous avons tous une compréhension commune de c'est quoi ADKAR, nous allons nous pencher sur un parcours personnel, sur mon parcours personnel, effectivement. So in the prior slide, I briefly explained that the first step, right, that anyone needs to pass through is something called awareness. And this first step is the most crucial one because for the majority of us, even when faced with at times overwhelming amounts of information in our lives, we remain stuck in awareness for a very long time. And this is simply because, folks, it's not the amount of information that's needed, right? The amount that's needed to overcome this step. You can be absolutely just overloaded with information and you can be super aware about anything. But if you don't desire that change, it's not going to happen, right? So it's the right type of information that usually serves as something that I like to call the tipping point in moving people from simply being aware about how, why, or what needs to change to actually desiring that change. So, you know, when we're talking about, in my own personal case, right, even despite being married to a Black woman and having mixed children, I was still, for the most part, complacent in my actions for almost my entire life. And sure, I was liking and sharing stuff on Facebook and LinkedIn and other social media platforms, but at the end of the day, I wasn't actually doing anything solid toward the change that I felt that I desired and I really wanted to see. Until one day I asked myself, why? What is blocking me here? If I really want to make a change, then why am I really not doing anything about it? And it was due to my white fragility. It was due to my comfort zone when faced with stress-inducing, racially charged situations that kept me in this first step called awareness pretty much my entire life, right? Despite even something as strong as my very own family dynamic. But all of this, however, was changed by a single event that unfortunately for me, I had to learn the hard way. It involved my son for now, which I'm going to share you now. It's a story. So I'll keep it brief, but basically you should all be able to see a picture of a t-shirt on the screen, but this is no ordinary t-shirt. It's a t-shirt with a picture of Spider-Man on it. Now, for those of you who may be fans of the Marvel Universe, I know I certainly am, and I know my son certainly is. Marvel recently, I think in the last few years, released a new spin-off of Spider-Man called Miles Morales, who happens to be this Black kid from Brooklyn. And, you know, like any parent, I understand that representation for my child is extremely important, right? And so when I see a version of Spider-Man like this coming out and my son is easily able to connect with it and he sees himself in it, I automatically understand that it's a good thing, right? Representation, it's a great thing. Me growing up in Canada as a little white kid, watching Marvel comics on TV in the morning, on Saturday mornings, Spider-Man was white, I was white. It was an easy thing for me. I didn't even have to think about it, right? So my son was almost waiting for something like this to happen, and he was super excited when he finally saw it. So about 2 years ago now, almost, I was walking in the store and I saw this t-shirt and I knew my son was excited about it. So what did I do? Of course, I grabbed it, I bought it, I brought it home and I showed my son and he was super excited to put it on. So the next day he put on his shirt and he was super proud. He went to school wearing the shirt. Later on that day, I went to go pick him up at school. And as he's walking out of school, he has this really long look on his face. And for those of you who don't know my son, you know, I don't expect you do. He's a very happy-go-lucky kid, a lot of energy, maybe a little bit too much at times, like any kid probably. And so, you know, me seeing him like this, especially after a day of school where he's usually excited and pretty happy, he didn't look like himself and I knew something was off. So as he got into the car, like any parent would, I started interrogating him, right? And he did not want to share anything. He was completely silent. He didn't want to do a thing. So the whole car ride home, it was complete silence. Even though I was asking him questions, he didn't want to answer anything. And so finally, when we got home, his mother saw the same look on his face and also started asking him questions. And it's at this point that my son, who at the time, by the way, was 7 years old, exploded on us, right? And he screamed the following. He said, "I'm really upset because all my friends at school were laughing at me and making fun of me because they told me that my t-shirt is stupid. They told me that Spider-Man is not supposed to be black. He's supposed to be white. And because of this, I never want to wear this t-shirt again." And then he stormed down the hallway to his room and he slammed the door. Now, you know, 7 years old, right? He's 7 when he's telling me this. So obviously, for me as a parent, I'm hearing this, and the first thing that I see and hear and feel is a portion of my son's innocence just vanish, gone. Never going to get that back, right? And on the flip side to that, I'm feeling all kinds of emotions. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm devastated, feeling all kinds of stuff, right? And it's at this exact moment, every time I tell this story, it brings me back that I'm internalizing that acknowledgement that systemic racism is definitely real. It's definitely part of our society. And so much so that it's now starting to affect my child at school. And it exists, right? It's deeply rooted in our society. I mean, how else could 7-year-olds at a school obviously unknowingly perpetuate something like this? So, you know, for anybody on the call who is perhaps contemplating the existence of systemic racism, I invite you to have a conversation with my son after what he went through. So that day, I made a promise to myself, my son, and my family that I was going to work toward dismantling systemic racism with every breath so long that I was alive. And I decided right then and there that I was going to be the change that I wanted to see. And it's at this exact moment that I liberated myself from my comfort zone, from my own white fragility and decided that I was going to make a change, right? And I instantly moved myself from that step called awareness to desire. Et l'événement avec mon fils a été pour moi l'ultime information que je devais entendre pour passer de la sensibilisation au désir, right? Le fait de me débarrasser de ma fragilité et de décider d'agir, qui est la deuxième étape, désir, n'a duré qu'un instant, right? Parce que j'avais tout ce que je fallait pour prendre ma décision. Et c'était clair comme le jour. J'avais besoin de changer et j'avais besoin d'agir concrètement. Alors, logiquement, pour agir concrètement, j'ai senti que je devais m'équiper de connaissances sur la race et le racisme, où j'ai exploré en profondeur le pourquoi, où et comment ça existe, ce qui me fait passer immédiatement à l'étape suivante qui est la connaissance. J'ai commencé à me poser des questions telles que d'où vient la race? Pourquoi ça existe? Pourquoi la race est, elle, si profondément ancrée dans les tissus de notre société? À tel point même, right, que des enfants de 7 ans peuvent démontrer qu'ils sont capables de perpétuer concrètement, sans le savoir, parmi nombreuses autres questions. So my search for knowledge in this third step in my journey about race and racism led to the discovery of new resources and information, right? And in this pursuit, I came across the work of Dr. Ibram Kendi, who's a leading anti-racism voice and scholar, as well as the founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. Dr. Kendi's work opened up my eyes to truths that I was definitely never taught in school growing up here in Canada. First of all, race, from a human historical standpoint, right, is a relatively new idea. Gomes de Zurara, who's a Portuguese biographer from the 15th century, is quoted according to the work of Dr. Kendi as the first person to propose the terminology relating to a hierarchy of different races and how this more modern interpretation of race didn't really exist in this way before his work invented it in the 15th century. This work, adopted by the Portuguese king at the time, went on to be adopted by every other Western colonial power, eventually grounding itself as the justification for the baseless enslavement and discrimination of people who were not of European origin. For example, people of African or indigenous descent. At its core, it's an idea that was invented to justify taking advantage of human beings as a means of economic gain. And this ongoing idea of race perpetuates that exact fundamental lie to this day. So oftentimes, right, due to popular discourse or mainstream media, negative attention is focused on those who are marginalized. But rarely are we ever nudged into introspectively looking within ourselves as the majority group and begin to ask ourselves some questions. So fueled by this continuous energy to seek more knowledge, I began educating myself on how to be anti-racist. I learned that racism exists within our systems, within our institutions, our cultural representations. It's in our media. It's in our school textbooks. It's in our movies. It's in our advertising. It's in the dominant discourse, and it manifests itself in varying degrees of extremity. I learned that we're all capable of expressing racist ideas and that no one person is inherently a racist. Rather, it's learned, and that there are varying degrees, of course, of how people choose to display racist behaviors and ideas. So at one end of that spectrum, you have people who are burning crosses on front lawns, who are engaging in racist, violent behavior and openly expressing racist ideas, of course. But on the other end of that spectrum, you have people claiming, right, that they don't see color and that they can't be a racist, right, because they got a black friend. But then they go on to engage in what they think is innocent behavior when asking questions to a colleague like, hey, where are you really from though? Right? Insinuating that they're not like you, that they are from somewhere else and are automatically categorized as the other person. The point here is the following. Even if you don't burn crosses on front lines or wear a white hooded robe, it still doesn't mean that you're not capable of expressing and engaging in racist behaviors on a daily basis. Right? What I came to understand was that even as someone married to a black woman with mixed children, I was still capable at any point in engaging in racist behaviors and thoughts, and that anyone is capable of doing it This was one of those aha moments for me, right? It opened up my eyes to understanding what microaggressions were, how my own, excuse me, how my own unconscious bias was affecting other people, and how this comfort zone, otherwise known as my white fragility, was keeping me from the stress-inducing racially charged situations and keeping me from those learning opportunities and challenging the status quo. So the next time that you're maybe curious about your colleague's hair, or you're curious about their family's potential origins, think twice, because these could be examples of racially charged microaggressive comments that can deeply affect those on the receiving end. So I invite you all just for a moment, right, to put yourself in the shoes of your colleague who at times, perhaps even multiple times per day, are asked questions like these amongst many others. Microaggressive comments and questions can really add up on folks, and it can really heavily weigh down your colleagues both physically and mentally. Everyone is capable of expressing racist ideas and behaviors. Please keep this in mind, especially if you always thought that you weren't capable of thinking racist thoughts and ideas or exhibiting racist behaviors. Alors, une fois que j'ai eu le sentiment d'avoir accumulé suffisamment de connaissances, j'ai commencé à agir de quoi qui me semblait en fait être la bonne direction, qui est la quatrième étape, la capacité. Ces actions se sont manifestées sous la forme d'une exploration de la notion d'alliance, afin de mieux comprendre ce que c'était, right? Et en fin de compte, j'ai appris comment être un bon allié, absolument, mais mon éducation, ça continue jusqu'à aujourd'hui et c'est sûr que ça va continuer. Alors, c'est quoi un allié, right? Alors, premièrement, être un allié, c'est marcher aux côtés ou avec ceux dont la voix est souvent ignorée et ou réduite au silence. Une alliance authentique demande du courage aussi. Et pour être une véritable allié, il faut faire un travail intérieur pour comprendre comment on participe à des systèmes injustes ou même oppressifs. Alors, peut-être vous avez par le passé bénéficié passivement ou même involontairement de politiques et pratiques qui vous donnaient des avantages injustes par rapport à d'autres personnes aussi ou même mieux qualifiées, par exemple. Pour être un allié, il est important aussi d'apprendre à écouter et à accepter la critique, même si c'est désagréable. Ne vous attendez pas que les autres vous enseignent ou vous montrent tout, right? Utilisez les outils que vous avez autour de vous pour apprendre et répondre à vos propres questions. L'alliance peut être aussi compliquée. Il ne faut pas croire que c'est facile. Il peut y avoir des dures leçons à apprendre aussi. Et dans de nombreux cas, ceux qui cherchent à être des alliés abandonnent lorsque les choses deviennent un peu difficiles. Et pour être un allié, il ne faut pas comparer vos propres circonstances comme étant aussi difficiles que les autres, right? Nous avons tous des problèmes. Certainement. Mais pour être un allié, il faut en fait être capable de mettre vos propres problèmes de côté et juste écouter puis aider. Finalement, de n'accepter pas d'être un allié pour les mauvaises raisons, right? Il peut être tentant d'essayer de prouver que vous faites partie des bonnes personnes, right? Mais gardez à l'esprit que les héros ne se qualifient pas eux-mêmes comme des héros. Réfléchissez aux raisons qui vous pousse à vouloir être un allié. Et si c'est pour recevoir la reconnaissance, l'alliance n'est probablement pas pour vous. Être un allié ne consiste pas à sauver quelqu'un. Et ce que l'alliance n'est pas, ça ne devrait pas être des actions ou des choses qui sont performatives. Right? On entend ça toujours. Le sous-ministre adjoint nous demande de créer une action d'antiracisme dans votre division, puis vous faites ça parce que vous êtes demandé de le faire, puis après que c'est complété, vous faites un petit coche sur votre liste. Ça, ce n'est pas l'alliance qui est véritable. Participer à l'activisme public pour être reconnu, mais ne pas être un activiste lorsque personne ne regarde, right? Moi, je faisais ça. J'ai posté des choses sur Facebook, LinkedIn, quoi que ce soit, mais dans la véritable, en fait, vie quotidienne de ma vie, qu'est-ce que je faisais? Je faisais absolument rien. Publier à propos d'un sujet sur les médias sociaux, comme je disais, parce qu'il fait partie des tendances, right? Alors, tu ne veux pas manquer le bateau. Tu dis des choses comme Black Lives Matter, tu mets ça sur Facebook et tu dis oui, moi, je suis un allié, mais tu ne fais rien d'autre. Désolé, ce n'est pas être un allié. Et comme j'ai dit ici, dire des choses comme la vie des Noirs compte mais de ne rien faire au concret au-delà de vos mots. Alors ça serait, mettons par exemple, des exemples de ce n'est quoi pas être un allié. So, right, how can, right, you be an effective ally? I can talk about the things that you need to do. I could talk about what allyship is not. But what I will share here is no point in reinventing the wheel. I'm going to share 10 points on how to be an ally that was previously shared as part of the Canada School Public Services Anti-Racism series that was actually posted a little bit more than a year and a half ago by Patricia Harwood, who's currently the Director of Representation and Legal Services at the Public Servants Alliance of Canada, right? And this can still be found on the CSPS website under the Anti-Racism Learning Series. So the first point, no secret here, you need to be an active listener, right? And what does that really mean? It means that when you have a marginalized colleague, right? It could be a friend, it could be a family member, it doesn't really matter, but somebody in your life who is marginalized, right? It could be racially, it could be religiously, it could be culturally. If they have enough courage to come to you and tell you about something that happened to them that was hurtful, then you need to make sure that you're not trying to immediately plug in little comments about how you know what it's like, because you don't. You don't. You need to actively listen. And that means you listen to the story, you take it in, and you ask follow-up questions to gain a better and even deeper understanding of what it is to go through something like that. Because the truth is, you most likely don't know. Number two, don't rely on others for your learning. It's one thing, right, to learn vicariously through the stories of your marginalized colleagues. That's fantastic. But it's another thing to continually go back to them and ask them about what you should be doing to be a great ally. That's not on them. That's on you. So you need to get out there. There's plenty of resources. There's documentaries you can watch, even on Netflix. There's books you can read. And if you don't have time to read and you don't have a lot to, and you have too much to do in your daily life, well, you know what? Get an audiobook account and start buying books and listening to them while you walk or whatever the case may be. There's always ways for you to find ways to learn about this kind of stuff. So you need to take charge of your own learning. Number three, you got to be able to accept criticism. All right. Allyship is not easy. You're going to make a lot of mistakes at the beginning, especially. I still make mistakes to this day. And you got to be able to accept the criticism when it comes your way, because ultimately it will make you a better ally and a better person and a better friend, etc. Number four, support marginalized public servant colleagues. And what does this mean? It can look like pretty much almost anything, right? Having presentations like this one at PAFSO is one way that we are supporting our marginalized public servant colleagues, especially in the forest servants ranks. I've also seen many departments simply hold, these brave spaces or these safe spaces where marginalized public servant colleagues are invited to share some of their lived experiences with colleagues who perhaps don't know these things. These would be examples of how we can support our marginalized public servant colleagues in ways that we haven't done before. Number five, you got to use your privilege to dismantle systemic racism, right? Everybody, even if you are marginalized, of course, you have a certain level of privilege. But for example, you take me, I'm the most privileged in Western society, and I know that, and I acknowledge that. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to use that as a tool to dismantle systemic racism every single day. And what I've chosen to do is I've chosen to build a deck and make a presentation like this one as many times as I possibly can to change people's minds and to start getting change and action going. So I'm using my privilege to dismantle systemic racism in that way. And I invite you to figure out a way that you can do that on your own. Number six, support the advancement opportunities of marginalized public servant colleagues. Depending on where you are, right, in your organization, you have a certain level of decision-making power. And some of you even have a certain level of decision-making power that can influence the advancement opportunities of those who are marginalized that we work with. Figure out ways to make that happen. Is it acting opportunities? Is it something as tangible as that? Or is it little micro missions? Or is it different things or different experiences that they need in order for them to advance in their careers? Figure that out with them and be a conduit for that in their careers. That would be number six. Number seven, don't expect rewards and recognition when facing the day-to-day problems. And I actually will go above and beyond here and say, just don't expect rewards and recognitions, period, right? You don't do this for a tap on the back. You don't do this for awards and recognition. I can tell you right now that I could not care less about getting recognition. I do this because it's the right thing to do. And two, I do this with the hope that I can possibly maybe help change that one person's heart and mind. And who knows, that person can end up having an influence on my child's or my children's lives in the future. For me, that would be enough. That's exactly why you do this. So you got to make sure that if you're going to be getting into this work, that you kind of tap into what's the real deep reasons why you want to do this work. And it needs to be genuine and it needs to be simple. Number 8, if you have decision-making power, if you are a manager, if you are a deputy director, if you are a director or etc. in the organization, you have decision-making power. Share that with people. Share that with people who are marginalized, who have different cultures than you do, who come from different walks of life than you do, who have different backgrounds than you do, perhaps a different age. It doesn't really matter. But the more decision-making power you share with people who don't think like you or who have similar backgrounds than you, then ultimately what ends up happening is you'll end up with having more well-rounded, better decisions that end up having more kind of, I guess you can say, ways of looking at a certain situation at the end of the day when it comes to making decisions. So share that decision-making power because you'll be better off. Number 9, build a professional network that includes marginalized public servant colleagues. Kind of building off of number 8 here, I challenge you to build your network of people around you who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't have the same background as you, who are possibly ethnically or culturally different than you are. Because what that ends up doing is that will bring certain levels of conversations and ways of thinking that otherwise you would not be surrounded with should you be in a room with people who all look and think like you, right? It'll just be the same thing over and over and over again. So challenging you to build your professional network that includes marginalized public servant colleagues, for example. And finally, folks, if you have the power, right, to provide evaluations for people or be references for people, you need to keep in mind that for our marginalized public servant colleagues, even on a day-to-day basis, they are having to deal with this weight, right, of unconscious bias, of microaggressions. And who's to say that performance on that day, right, might be affected by something like that. So just keep in mind when you're giving evaluations or when you're giving references for those who are marginalized, that it's very possible that there's a lot of extra things that they have to deal with that, for example, I wouldn't have to deal with on a daily basis, right? We all know that notion, bring your whole self to work. I never got to think twice about that. Of course, I can bring my whole self to work, but my colleagues who are marginalized sometimes, right, have to code switch, have to do different things where they cannot bring their whole selves to work, and that can affect performance on a daily basis. So keep that in mind when it comes time to give references or when it comes time to evaluate. Et c'est là donc que mon voyage se poursuit aujourd'hui, right? Il ne suffit pas de s'éduquer, agir qu'une seule fois et d'arrêter là. Il faut que ce soit durable. Et c'est pourquoi que je travaille continuellement à renforcer ce que j'ai appris et à m'engager activement dans de nouvelles façons de développer mes connaissances et de les transmettre aux autres personnes par les biais, mettons, de conférences comme celle-ci. Utiliser ADCAR, adopter des comportements antiracistes et être un allié sont comme des muscles, right? Si vous ne les utilisez pas, vous les perdez. Alors, le renforcement constant n'est pas seulement durable, mais il permet aussi la croissance. So, going to start wrapping up here with a call to action. Change has to start somewhere. And there's no better place than to start by looking within introspectively and putting in the work on yourself. And usually the first thing you got to do is you got to get past the fear of losing something if you're part of the majority group, right, in this country like myself. Equity, true equity, is not a zero-sum game, right? There are no winners and losers if all of us are pursuing something like true equity. I know, for example, that, I did not personally invent the idea of race. And I don't have any guilt about being a white person or belonging to the majority group in Canada. But because I have inherently by design been privileged my entire life just because of something like the color of my skin, I feel that I have a great sense of responsibility, right, in actively dismantling the idea of race and engaging in anti-racist activities and behaviors and ideas every single day. And so I'm calling on all of you to share in having that great sense of responsibility with me. And I can only speak for myself, right, where I have specifically chosen the topic of race as my door to the greater discussion on things like human rights, dignity and equity for everyone. But truly, it doesn't matter whether the approach you choose is anchored in race or religion or anything else. What's important is that you focus on yourself and how you relate to other people. And so in saying this, I invite you all to also reflect on that greater discussion about how we relate to other people and how this messaging is perpetuated negatively through things like systemic discrimination. So when you feel you're ready, do the work at your own pace. Find your own tipping point, just like I found mine, and discover what piece of information you need to move yourself from simply being aware to desiring that change. Be the change you want to see every single day and walk the walk. Don't just talk, take action. Turn that fragility into humility. Be humble, accept your privilege, and use it to actively dismantle systemic discrimination as we move forward. And so I hope some of you are now going to be leaving this presentation feeling inspired to change, and that you become effective change agents yourselves and dismantling systemic discrimination. And I just want to finish off by sharing the following by the late, great Nelson Mandela, where he was quoted as saying once that if you talk to someone in a language they understand, that goes to their head. But if you talk to them in their language, that goes to their heart. So with that, I want to say merci beaucoup de m'écouter ce matin, aujourd'hui, avec la présentation. Et ça va nous amener maintenant à la période de questions et réponses. Et bien sûr, je vous invite aussi de vous demander vos questions dans la langue de votre choix, tout à fait à l'aise de répondre en français qu'en anglais. Please ask away the questions in the language of your choice. Happy to answer at this point. So I think at that point, what I'll do is I'll stop the screen share and I'll shoot it over to you, I believe, Iris.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was phenomenal. It's not the first time I've heard it, but I learn something every time. So very much appreciate it. We had, I think, I'm not sure if the recording shows what's in the chat, but I just wanted to highlight, Pam, what you had mentioned about evaluation of people that you're managing. I don't know if you wanted to talk on that to start off our discussion.
No, sure. I mean, it's just one of the things. I mean, Ryan mentioned, make sure that you're evaluating, people with marginalized identities fairly. And the flip side that I have become aware of is thinking, okay, you might be able to be very fair and objective in looking at, other people, but is the problem more that you're overlooking bad behavior or problems in people who, you see as fitting the mold, belonging? I mean, I became aware of this in a discussion with our colleague CJ, where we were talking about, stuff in the news about, a certain celebrity who had been one of the people who'd gone to jail, right, for all the, for rape, basically multiple cases of rape. And we were saying, of course this person deserved this, but it's not a coincidence that the first one really prosecuted for all this stuff in Hollywood was a Black guy, right? And that felt a little bit uncomfortable. And then we had we got into the discussion, and it made me sort of realize that, no, the problem is not that somebody goes to jail for serious crimes like that, but that so many others don't. It's like, it's not like you shouldn't be going after that person, but you should be going after everyone, to the same extent. And I think back on it so often where I've heard people really making excuses, at all levels of society, but, we're talking about the workplace, like, oh, well, that person obviously belongs here, but they made a mistake. They had a bad day. They yelled, they did this. There must be something else going on. Whereas the inclination is to look at people who don't fit the mold so well and say, not sure if that person has the right stuff. And I think that's something, we have to be aware of as well. And you don't want to, like, people will say, oh, well, you shouldn't be softening your standards. Well, no, maybe you shouldn't be softening your standards for anyone. You need to be applying them evenly.
Iris, do you have anything you want to add before I jump in?
No, go ahead.
Are you sure? Yeah. Pam, it makes me think about, I don't know if you've had a chance to see this, but it was a wonderful keynote presentation on the notion of merit. That was given by Dr. Rachel Zellers by the CSPS, and I think I see you going like this. So when hearing you talk, it made me think of that, right? It's like, for me, I even a step back further, and I go, well, wait a minute, like, we're evaluating here, and what are we even basing it on? And are we basing it on merit? And if we're basing it on merit, what is merit? And where does merit come from, right? And like, is merit, who is it made by? Who is it decided by? In large cases, it was decided by someone who looks like me, right? And it's just like, okay, so if we're holding that as the standard for how we evaluate people, then that's also a huge issue too, right? And so, yeah, I walked away from that presentation like questioning all kinds of stuff, and started realizing, like, wow, it's deep, right? Like, this whole notion of even just how we evaluate and how we decide who's deserving and who's not, etc. It goes deep, right, into the design of how things are done.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we see these standards set up by people who are able to fit them easily, right? And whole things about, well, what's professionalism? I mean, really, do you need to wear a suit? I remember I did when I did an assignment in Afghanistan, I was supposed to be the NATO POLAD. And I was supposed to be reporting to a German general. And I got off the plane and he looked at me and said, nope, wrong age, wrong gender, wrong demeanor. Looked at the POLAD, who was the POLAD for the Operation Enduring Freedom commander, who was a 50-something, I was in my late 30s at the time. This guy was 20 years older than me and a man with a tie, and said, I want a real POLAD like that. It's like, and I mean, and I don't have, I didn't have race to be evaluated by him on either. So it's, I think examining those things, do you really need to wear a suit and a tie to be good at your job? And all of these different things. I was thinking about your story about Spider-Man, and I mean, there was just this thing about the Little Mermaid that came out, right? And the Little Mermaid is black, and all people completely freak out. And I saw on Twitter how people were saying, well, listen, think about this. These are people who are reacting to a fairy tale or a cartoon character. Those same people are hiring.
Yep.
What if those people are hiring doctors, or like evaluating medical student applications, or all of those things? And it's like, it's quite frightening.
It is frightening. It is frightening, and I don't recall, but I mean, I'm sure, like, there's been loads and loads of people who said this, right, even over the years, especially recently. But it's that subtle racism, right, too, like where you're not going to catch people saying these comments, but yeah, what decisions are they making in the boardroom? What decisions are they making subconsciously about who they hire? Or is it going to be overt, right, like in your face, like what happened to you getting off that plane in Afghanistan too, right? Like that's yeah. And I'm sorry that happened to you. That sounded really, no, but that's very uncomfortable and fortunate. It must have been something pretty hard to deal with.
It was tough at the time, but I was lucky because there was a deputy commander there who turned out to be much better to work for, and I just went to work for him and had a much better experience, right? Even though theoretically I was a notch lower down in the hierarchy, I had a better experience. And I guess, that would be something I think maybe to keep in mind is, like, sometimes it might be more important who your boss is, and finding that right environment, or being able to provide that right environment for somebody, than where you are in terms of, the explicit opportunity. Because it would not, I mean, in the end, that guy got who he wanted, And he just had the guy follow him around taking notes at meetings with ambassadors all the time. Whereas I had a much more interesting job, you know, in the end. So
I'm happy that it worked out for you, though. I mean, happy that it worked out positively after that happened to you.
I wanted to pull this into sort of a more FS context, and I wanted to add some dimensions that we often experience when we're overseas, which is that sometimes the race equation is flipped. We may be, you know, the outsider coming into a mission in Africa, but there still exists power dynamic and, you know, issues of seniority. And I wanted to ask how you thought to use some of the tools that you talked about to deal with this other kind of scenario.
It's a really great question, and you know, I'm I'm going to be thinking about this a lot, Iris, in the next year or so, because I'll likely be posted probably somewhere in Africa. It's in the coming future. Those are my interests, and I've been thinking about that. Like, how am I going to react? How I'm going to be, you know, what's going to happen if something, you know, comes up, and what I've realized is that I don't know, the first kind of off the cuff kind of reaction that I'm going to have is that at the end of the day, as a CBS, there's always going to be that CBS LES thing going on that I'm going to do my best to address, right? And make very clear first and foremost that, you know, we're all working together here, and there's going to be no difference. I'm going to do my best to make sure that there's no differences in that regard, no matter how hard or tempting it may be, because I've heard horror stories about these kind of things, right? So that's the first kind of thing. The other thing is, even in a context like Africa, right? At the end of the day, there's a colonial past in 90% of African countries. And you need to be aware of that the second you step into a room, whether or not the governing, you know, the governing kind of body is made up of a democratically elected African, you know, population. It still doesn't matter, because in 90% of these contexts, there was people like me who were there, you know, maybe even not too long ago, calling the shots, right? And this can have an effect on my colleagues, especially who may happen to be LESs, right? And I need to make sure that I keep that top of mind, because who knows? Like, you know, I'm showing up on the scene. I'm a new CBS. It's a rotating door every few years. We're always changing, but they usually are the same people that have been working there for 10, 15, 20 years. Not only do I need them, and they are essential for my job, and they serve as corporate memory, but they also have their baggage that they bring with them. And who knows what kind of interactions they've had with my colleagues in the past, which could have been hurtful, or some personal baggage that they bring from their personal lives, where they had some very negative experiences working or being with white people, right? So it's just to be mindful of that, cognizant of that, and, you know, slowly opening up that door to having conversations with those folks, to let them know that, you know, you're there to work with them, you're there to listen, and you're there to you know, to open up, and should they wish to share, of course, never force, but should they wish to share, you're doing it with open arms and open ears.
That's some great advice, and I think something that we all need to think about, because those horror stories you referred to, they are real. I've witnessed them firsthand. I had one more question, which I think after which we will wrap up, but I was hoping you could give some perspective from your time on the Anti-Racism Secretariat. So currently, missions have mandatory committees like occupational health and safety. Even there's like green committees that are kind of mandatory for most missions, but DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, they are not. And I wonder what your thoughts are on whether it would force this sort of work into the performative space if it becomes a mandated committee, versus the value of having something at all missions around the world, because currently it's just based upon what HOM has the energy and interest, what CBS and LES want to take this on, because it's really work that needs to be done and recognized as genuine work, and not just something that people do voluntarily off the corner of their desk.
You know, Iris, you summarized it at the end of your sentence there in ways that I see it too. So, you know, to kind of piggyback on some of the words that you were using, some of the key words, genuine, needs to be genuine. And I know there's competing priorities. I know there's always something that comes up, but it should not be because a Ham is passionate about it that it ends up being something that's important. Now it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, like you were saying. Like if we make it mandatory, it will for sure. And I'm telling you this, full disclosure, I know, I've seen the numbers, I've interacted with people. I know that at some missions abroad, it will be performative. It will be, let's just get this done. It's not important to me. I don't care. However, with that, the flip side is that some missions, depending on who the Ham is, of course, will take this and go, you know what? I've always wanted to do this, and now I'm being asked to do it in a kind of formative way. Let's get this done in a real way, right? Let's connect with the branch liaisons. Let's connect with the anti-racism secretary. Let's see if we can make this meaningful, right? So I do think that it definitely won't hurt. I don't think it would hurt, even if it's mandatory. I still think it won't hurt. But what I don't, and I know you know this too, and I'm sure pretty much everyone feels the same way, is that if it does end up being a performative thing, what ends up getting lost is the importance behind it. Because what people lack to understand is that D&I is not just D&I. It has tentacles in everything. It has tentacles in trade. It has tentacles in policy. It has tentacles in MCO work. It has tentacles in everything that we do, IRCC, immigration. If all of us are able to take on a program and see it as meaningful, it will really help with your decision-making, day-to-day basis. It'll help with your relationships with LES. It'll help with your decision-making when it comes time to make a decision, for example, on an immigration file, right? It'll help you gain a better understanding of perhaps where people are coming from when we're talking about a trade agreement. Like it really does bring value in that way. And I think that once people understand that it's not only the right thing to do, but it will actually help you in your work and it will actually yield better results, then I think that's when people will start taking it seriously. But until that happens, you're just going to get, right, the people who already believe in this doing the work and probably burning out, right? Because it ends up being side of the desk work. I don't know if any of you have read the book by Dr. Robert Livingston or have had the chance to hear him speak at one of his conferences or so on and so forth. But I know that all the executives at Global Affairs Canada, along with National Defense and another one, were all invited to a presentation by Dr. Livingston. And he summarized basically when it comes to this work, there's like basically 3 different types of people, okay? The first one are, and he summarizes them in groups of like animals, which is actually quite humorous, but at the same time, you'll understand where he's coming from. It's quite funny. So he says the first group are the people who already bought in, they're already sold on this and anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion work, and they're called the dolphins, right? These people don't need to be convinced. They're going to hop on, they're going to get going, and they're going to want to do this work right now. They see the value behind it. But he said that where it gets tricky is with the other 2 groups. And so the dolphins make up, he said, roughly about a 30 to 40% makeup within any given department or population, give or take. But the other group is called the ostriches. So the ostriches are a group where they need a carrot, right? They need to be convinced of what's in it for me, right? And the second they're convinced about what's in it for them, then they go, you know what? Yeah, anti-racism work is good because they know in the back of their head that it's probably going to help them get their job done. So they'll do it. Now, is it the best way to go about it? Probably not, but will it help move the dial forward and also maybe increase their chances of becoming dolphins later? Yes, it will. And that group makes up almost, surprisingly, the same amount of percentage as the dolphins. So that's a very big group of people who constantly need a carrot dangled in front of them for them to be able to understand that this work is super important. But the last group, he called them the sharks. So this is the group which accumulates to about, and he did like thousands and thousands of surveys. So that's where he's getting these percentages from. This last group is 10%. And it's the sharks. This group, it's a lost cause. These people are completely only in it for themselves. They don't care about anybody else or anything else other than their own self-success. And for them, what they need is a stick, right? So they need sometimes to be given that whack by a person who's in charge for them to get in line. And the second that they know that their career is on the line, or the second that they know that it could affect anything in their personal lives where something is at stake, and they get the stick, that's the only time that they'll get in line. But those people will usually end up going back to their old ways. And that's a 10% of that population. So I know that as you're hearing me explain this, you're thinking, okay, yeah, I can think of a few group of people who belong in each one of those groups. And that's something that, you know, we need to keep in mind and keep cognizant of. But the good news when sharing this, Dr. Livingston, what he was saying was that if you do the math, you're talking about almost 90% of people. Even if you use carrots, though, 90% of people who would be willing to do this work in a way that's positive. So, you know, if we look at it that way, then I'm thinking that, okay, well, then maybe we will find ourselves in a good place. So this was a really long answer to your question. But I do think that the mandatory piece could work. Probably will have to include carrots. And then the other 40% of the dolphins will take it on, probably lead on this thing. The dolphins need to understand that they have to have a whole basket of carrots with them to make sure that the other 40% of their colleagues hop on. And then once that's done, then we're going to be in smooth sailing. So I do think it would be a good thing, but everybody needs to be aware that that's the type of people we'll be dealing with most likely.
That was a long answer, but it was a great answer. So thank you so much. I love it every time we have a chance to chat, and I hope many people get to listen to this recording afterwards, because I think there's a lot of good information in here for all of us. Thank you again for speaking for this, and good luck to you on wherever you end up on for your posting.
And so, guys, could I just jump in? I just want to thank Ryan, but also can we suggest, like, what we've been doing is we'll ask Marty to stop the recording, and